Hey everyone! Today, we're going to talk about the Illyrians, an ancient group of people who lived in the Western Balkans a long time ago. They were around even before the Greeks and Romans wrote about them, and their history is filled with interesting stories about their culture, battles, and way of life. So, who were the Illyrians? They were one of the main groups living in the Balkans back in ancient times, along with the Greeks and Thracians. The Greeks and Romans called their land Illyria, which covered what is today Albania, Montenegro, Kosovo, a large part of Croatia and Bosnia, and parts of Serbia and Slovenia. Basically, they controlled a huge area stretching from the Adriatic Sea to several major rivers. The first time the Illyrians were mentioned in written history was in the 6th century BC by an ancient Greek writer named Hecataeus of Miletus. But here's something interesting. Illyrians probably never actually called themselves that. The Greeks seem to have come up with the name, likely based on one particular tribe they met first. Over time, they started using Illyrians to refer to many different tribes in the region, even though those people may not have seen themselves as one big group. For a long time, scholars tried to figure out exactly who the Illyrians were. At first, historians grouped a bunch of different tribes together and called them all Illyrians, but by the 1960s, archaeologists and linguists became more precise. Based on their names and artifacts, they identified two main Illyrian regions, one in the south and another in the Dalmatian-Pannonian area. There was also a third region to the north, but those people seemed to have more in common with the Venetic language than Illyrian. Some Illyrians even traveled to Italy, like the Dauni, Pucetii, and Mesapi, who were known as the Iapyges, and spoke the Mesopic language. By the 7th century AD, the name Illyrians disappeared from history. What happened to them? That's still debated. Some believe they blended with new groups moving into the region, like the Slavs. Others think the Albanian language may have developed from an old Illyrian dialect, though there's no clear proof yet. Now let's talk about their name. The word Illyrian comes from the Greek and Latin versions of what may have been their real tribal name, something like Hilurio or Halurio, which possibly meant water snake. This makes sense because another tribe in the region, the Inkalai, had a name that meant eel people, so there was definitely a water theme going on. The Greeks likely picked up the name from one Illyrian tribe in the south and then applied it to all the tribes in the area. Throughout history, the terms Illyrians, Illyria, and Illyricum changed in meaning. The first Greek writings described them as a barbarian people, and by the 5th century BC, they were seen as a major group in the Balkans. The Greeks thought of them as completely different from the Thracians and Macedonians, even though they lived nearby. At first, Illyrian only referred to the southeastern Adriatic region, but later the Romans used it to describe a much larger area. But were the Illyrians actually one single group? Most modern historians say no. They were a mix of many different tribes, not one united culture or language. Some groups, like the Bregues, wouldn't have even considered themselves Illyrians. The Greeks likely just used the name to describe all the different groups in the area instead of a specific ethnicity. The Romans also had their own view of the Illyrians. Writers like Pliny the Elder and Pomponius Mela used the term Illyrii propri dicti, meaning properly called Illyrians, to describe a specific group living along the coast of what is now Albania and Montenegro. Some historians believe this referred to the old Illyrian kingdom, which existed from the 4th century BC until the Romans took over in 167 BC. Others think the name originally referred to just a small tribe near modern-day central Albania, and that Rome's first encounters with the Illyrians happened in this area. And during the Iron Age, the Illyrians lived in the Balkans, farming and raising animals. Their land was rough and mountainous, which shaped their way of life. Some of the first Illyrian kingdoms appeared in the south, with the Enchili being one of the earliest. They were powerful around the 8th to 7th centuries BC, but by the 6th century BC, their influence faded as new Illyrian groups took over. One of these groups, the Daceretii, later controlled the area around Lychnidus Lake. Another important Illyrian tribe was the Taulantii, who lived along the coast. By the 7th century BC, they were already in contact with Greek city-states. At one point, they asked Corcyra and Corinth for help against the Liburnians, which led to the founding of the Greek colony of Epidamnus in 627 BC. This colony became a busy trade center. Even with Greek influence, the Taulantii stayed powerful and played a big role in Illyrian politics until the 4th century BC. The Illyrians often fought with their neighbors. They clashed with the ancient Macedonians, especially when Philip II of Macedon started expanding his power. In 358 BC, Philip defeated the Illyrian leader Bardillus, shifting control in the region. After that, another Illyrian group, the Grabii under Grabos II, gained power, but they also had to deal with Macedonian attacks. By the late 4th century BC, King Glaucias of the Taulantii had become very powerful, making both war and peace deals with the Greeks and other Illyrian tribes. Further west, the Daers, an Illyrian tribe near the Neretva Delta, were heavily influenced by Greek culture. Their main city, Dorsan, became a stronghold with large stone walls and a thriving bronze industry. Like many Illyrian groups, they found themselves caught between bigger powers as Greek and later Roman influence spread. By the 3rd century BC, some Illyrian tribes began forming larger alliances. One of the strongest leaders was King Agron, who ruled over an Illyrian kingdom stretching from central Albania to parts of modern Bosnia and Herzegovina. He built a strong navy, using fast ships to control the Adriatic Sea. In 231 BC, his forces won a big battle against the Aetolians. But Agron died soon after, and his wife, Queen Teuta, took over as regent for their young son Pinus. Teuta's rule was a difficult time. She continued Agron's military expansion, but her support of piracy brought trouble. Illyrian pirates had already been a problem for trade, but under Teuta they became an even bigger threat. This led Rome to take action in 229 BC, starting the Illyrian Wars. Over the next few decades, Rome fought several wars against Illyrian rulers, including Demetrius of Pharos and Gentius. By 168 BC, Rome had defeated the Illyrians and taken control. Even under Roman rule, the Illyrians held on to their identity. In the 1st century AD, a major rebellion, the Great Illyrian Uprising, challenged Roman rule. Leaders like Bato the Brutian and Bato the Dizitiate united different tribes to fight against Rome. The Romans eventually crushed the rebellion, but it was one of the biggest challenges they faced in the Balkans. Over time, the Illyrians became part of the Roman Empire. Many were moved to different regions and worked as miners, traders, or soldiers. By the 3rd century AD, Illyrians were an important part of the Roman military, and even produced some of Rome's greatest emperors, known as the Illyrian emperors. Leaders like Decius, Aurelian, and Diocletian came from Illyrian backgrounds and shaped Roman history. As time passed, Illyria changed from a tribal name to an official Roman region. By the 7th century AD, the name Illyrian stopped appearing in most records, though the term was sometimes used in Byzantine writings. Later, during the Middle Ages, Illyrian was sometimes used to describe Albanians and other Balkan people. And now, let's talk about how their culture, language, and identity evolved through centuries of interaction with surrounding civilizations. The Illyrians spoke an ancient Indo-European language, but most of it has been lost. Experts aren't sure if it was more like Latin or Slavic languages, and since they didn't leave many writings, we only have bits and pieces to study. As they came into contact with different groups like the Celts, Greeks, Romans, and Slavs, their language slowly faded away. One of the closest known languages to Illyrian is Mesapic, which was spoken in parts of southern Italy. People believe the Messapians came from Illyria, bringing their language with them. But because there's not enough evidence, it's unclear if Mesapic was just a related language or actually a version of Illyrian. Greek culture had a big impact on the Illyrians, especially in the south. Many Illyrians spoke Greek alongside their own language. Some scholars once thought Illyrian was connected to other ancient languages like Venetic and Thracian, but these ideas are now mostly rejected. There's also a long-running debate about whether modern Albanian comes from Illyrian. Some experts say it does, while others think it comes from Thracian instead. Unfortunately, there isn't enough proof to be sure either way. One way researchers study Illyrian language is through names. By looking at names found in inscriptions, they have identified three main regions where Illyrians lived: the south, modern Albania and Montenegro; the center, Bosnia, Dalmatia, and western Serbia; and the north, Slovenia. The northern region had more in common with Venetic than Illyrian. When it comes to religion, the Illyrians worshipped many gods, often connected to nature and the sky. The sun was an important symbol, appearing in their art as spirals and circles. They also saw animals as sacred, with different tribes favoring different ones. Northern Illyrians honored water birds and horses, while southern Illyrians respected snakes. Unlike the Greeks and Romans, the Illyrians didn't have one big pantheon of gods. Each tribe had its own deities. Some of their gods included Dei Patris, the sky father; Prende, the goddess of love; and Perendi, a thunder god. Coastal tribes honored Radon, a protector of sailors, while Medorus, shown as a warrior on horseback, was popular in some areas. The Romans introduced their god Silvanus, who became widely worshipped among Illyrians. The Illyrians also believed in magic and used spells and charms to protect themselves from evil. Sometimes, they even practiced human sacrifice, though this was rare. Burial customs varied. Wealthier people were buried under large mounds and surrounded by their possessions, such as weapons, jewelry, and pottery. Archaeologists have found many different Illyrian cultures, making it hard to define a single Illyrian identity. One of the most important cultures was the Cetina culture, which spread across the Adriatic from Croatia to Albania and left behind burial sites and artifacts. DNA studies suggest that the Cetina people played a major role in the ancestry of later Illyrians. By the Iron Age, around the 7th century BCE, different Illyrian tribes had developed their own styles. The Japodes, who lived in modern Croatia and Bosnia, were known for their unique jewelry, including large bronze bracelets and colorful glass decorations. Other Illyrians borrowed ideas from both Greek and Celtic cultures, and some even fully adopted Celtic traditions. Later in the early Middle Ages, the Illyrians faced pressure from Slavic migrations. However, in places like northern Albania, Montenegro, and Kosovo, some Illyrian traditions survived. One key archaeological site from this period is Komani Kruja. The Komani Kruja culture existed between the late Roman period and the Middle Ages in modern Albania and parts of North Macedonia. These settlements were built near fortresses and trade routes, keeping them connected to the Roman and Byzantine worlds. Many historians believe the people of Komani Kruja were descendants of Romanized Illyrians, who kept many of their traditions alive. Some Albanian researchers even argue that they were the ancestors of modern Albanians, but this is still debated. During the 20th century, some Yugoslav scholars tried to claim that Komani Kruja was a Slavic culture, but later studies proved this wrong. New archaeological research after 2009 showed that the site was much larger than previously thought, covering over 40 hectares. It had roots in the Hellenistic era but remained important well into the medieval period. Even after the collapse of Roman rule, people in the mountainous areas managed to maintain their unique culture despite all the changes happening around them. So, what can we learn from all this? The Illyrians weren't one single group, but many different tribes with their own languages, traditions, and religions. Over time, their contact with the Greeks, Romans, and later Slavs changed them, and their language eventually disappeared. But even though we don't hear Illyrian spoken today, its influence can still be seen in history and archaeology.